are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and I'm here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about military history, doctrine, and leadership practices, and then translate those into lessons we can apply to our businesses and professional practices. So today is the second episode of a 24 episode series that really is looking at military strategy across the various service branches, kind of pulling it together and then separating it into 5 parts that really gets down to how does the military operate on a strategic level, the military writ whole, right? Operate on a strategic basis. What are the components, and how do we then integrate those into our businesses to make them more successful? So today, Siri is going off all of a sudden. So today, I'm going to be talking about choosing the battlefield. I think that's what I'm going to be talking about. All of a sudden, I just want to make sure I'm on the right episode for you. Wow. Yes, choosing the battlefield. Okay, good. Sorry about that. This is the second episode in this series, and it's also the second episode of the first sort of arc, which is dealing sort of purely with strategy issues. So the core idea of this idea of choosing the battlefield really comes from Sun Tzu, who wrote The Art of War. And I did a whole episode on Sun Tzu and the philosophy that is embodied in The Art of War. But it essentially deals with that victory oftentimes is determined before the first clash, before the first battle. So in both war and businesses, so leaders do not they don't merely fight well, they choose wisely when and where to fight, right? And so when we probably all know instances of businesses, and one of the most notable in history being the new Coke debacle, where Coke decided to take on Pepsi by essentially trying to replicate Pepsi's taste. Coke and Pepsi taste different. Anybody who's had them knows that, and that's, I think, why people have their preferences, right? So the Coca-Cola company did not choose its battlefield wisely by changing its flavor formula away from what it had been for decades upon decades, trying to make it sort of a faux Pepsi, right? That is not choosing to fight where to fight wisely, right? So what this episode is going to cover is why many companies lose, not because of weak execution, but because they commit themselves to the wrong market or the wrong category or the wrong competitive terrain. Okay, so like all of these episodes, I'm going to on Business Lessons from the Military, I'm going to talk about the military doctrine first, so you can understand the source material, if you will, and then I'll extend it into lessons for the business world. Okay, so choosing the battlefield, what it means in war. So the battlefield is more than just the actual ground on which a particular battle is fought. It's really the conditions of the conflict. And a wise commander wants to set up the best overall set of conditions before he comes into contact with the enemy. Okay, so if you watch, movies of the U.S. cavalry, during the set during the 19th century, right? Oftentimes you'll see the Indians will have the high ground. They'll be hidden in the rocks on some kind of pass, and then the cavalry is filing through, single file between what looks like kind of two cliffs, right? Okay, this is not choosing good battles of condition. When a force has got the high ground, they can project all of their destruction, onto people below them much more easily than the people below can, number one, protect themselves, and number two, project force back. Right? That's sort of a classic, film trope, if you would, about the conditions of a conflict. But there, it's more than just terrain. So, and the again, the wise commander seeks to create the best conditions before contact with the enemy. Okay, so there is terrain, there's geography, there's infrastructure, there's choke points. So you may have flat ground, you may have hilly ground, you may have plateaus, you may have rivers, you may have an ocean, you may have a lake, you may have forest, you may have open plains, you may have fields with crops growing or animals grazing, right? All of these are issues of terrain. On the sea, you may have a situation where, like, the Black Sea goes into the Mediterranean Sea through the Dardanelles, which is a choke point. You have the same thing at the Strait of Gibraltar. You have the same thing at the Suez Canal, right? You have choke points where it's more difficult for shipping to get through, number one, but just maneuver in general, right? Lakes are harder for ships. They're harder for ships to maneuver in than would be an ocean. On the other hand, like in World War II in the Pacific theater of operations, so these the islands that were surrounded by coral reefs, so those are harder to approach on a terrain basis than an island that didn't have a coral reef. There were islands that had natural harbors, easier to approach than an island without a natural harbor. Okay, so those are all the factors of terrain. Okay, so that's number one. Number two is timing. So when to engage, when to delay or avoid conflict. Should the engagement begin, at dawn? Should it be at night? What is the point of the engagement? Is it some sort of special operation? Okay, where secrecy is absolutely necessary, and so the cover of darkness, although it may be more difficult in which to operate in it, still, because it helps protect the secrecy of the mission, that may be a better time to engage than during the daylight hours. Take the Normandy landings, right? So the issues of tides, weather, availability of shipping, all of those factors went into eventually the date being set for June 5th. And then because of some adverse weather, it got delayed a day until June 6th, right? And here's the thing. If the weather had not cleared, and if General Eisenhower had not given the go-ahead for the Normandy landings, the timing would have had to have been put off for another month, okay? Because that was the next time that the tides were favorable and the other timing issues were favorable, right? So timing is another aspect of choosing the battlefield. Next is opportunities for force disruption. So, where is the point at which strength can meet weakness? Okay, going back to that example of the Normandy invasion, one of the reasons why, in the end, General Eisenhower settled on the invasion on invading at Normandy was because the Germans appeared to be convinced that the invasion of Europe would come at the Pas de Calais. And in fact, Hitler believed that even after the initial landings on Normandy, Adolf Hitler continued to believe that the Pas de Calais was going to be where the real invasion started, and that Normandy was just a feint. Okay, and now there were reasons for that. There was um, intelligence operations and such to you know, keep Hitler believing that. But nonetheless, the fact that Hitler held back a lot of his forces meant that the invading armies on Normandy were hitting strength with weakness, relatively so, right? I mean, Normandy was still heavily defended, but not as heavily defended as it would have been without the deception and Hitler's belief that the main invasion would come at the Pas de Calais. Okay, and then another factor of choosing the battlefield is operational reach. So it's one thing to be able to mount a battle, mount an invasion, but as you continue to make progress, an army, or for that matter, a navy, may be getting farther and farther away from their supply depots. They may be stretching their forces ever thinner, which reduces the endurance of those forces. And so the ability to sustain the forces, sustain the momentum, starts to attenuate uh, as the operational reach gets longer and longer, right? So again, choosing how does one choose a battlefield that will provide for the level of sustainment necessary to keep the momentum going? Okay. And then finally, enemy constraints. So, how can the battlefield be chosen in a way that forces the enemy into an unfavorable or a constrained position? Okay. So, going back to the Pacific Theater in World War II. So, at first, the American strategy was to conquer each island one by one by one, right? But then pretty quickly, the senior leadership realized they didn't have to conquer every single island. In fact, they could do what came to be called island hops. So they would take one island and then they would look for the next strategic island to take, which often left some in between that were still held by the Japanese. But by hopping over those islands and taking the next one and cutting off the Japanese forces from, among other things, resupply of food, so those forces withered on the vine. That was how they described it, right? So um, and the Japanese, especially in the beginning, didn't really grasp the strategy that the United States was following. And you know, had they could have withdrawn their forces, reinforced the strategic points at which the Americans were going to land, or at least which they thought they were going to land. Um, but they ended up not doing that, and as a result, they kept their forces dispersed, and that meant they were in a less favorable position than the invading American Marines and soldiers. Okay, so all of these factors taken together are a part of choosing the battlefield. Okay, so so Sun Tzu summarized this concept simply. He said, "He who knows the terrain and himself will never be in peril." Now, you might say, well, that's kind of an oversimplification. Okay, maybe it is. But the reality is that the better we know the conditions under which we're going, well, from a military standpoint, the better a commander knows the conditions under which his forces will have to fight, the less peril he faces. Okay, and a similar thing is true in business as well, as I'll take up in a moment. So, how does this idea of choosing the battlefield then show up in contemporary military practice? Well, first of all, in the U.S. Marine Corps' maneuver warfare doctrine, it prioritizes position over attrition. So when I started this show, now this is the fourth year, so over 3 years ago, the first series of episodes I did was on Marine Corps warfighting doctrine, and one of there is an episode. If you want to go back and find it, you can see that there's an episode on position over attrition, right? This idea of choosing the battlefield, that's a better way to go than just sending your forces and pounding away, leading to much higher casualty among your soldiers, your Marines, your sailors, your airmen, etc. Right? So position is always a better way to approach a battle than just using brute force. Okay. So, air power doctrine also seeks to dominate the battle space before the ground forces move in. Okay, so you'll see strategic and even tactical bombing that goes on before forces land. Let's go back to the Pacific, where when there was an amphibious landing, both ships, cruisers, and battleships would shell a particular island in an effort to soften up the defenses before the Marines hit the beach. But also sometimes aircraft would be used as well to drop munitions on a targeted beach. And the idea was to dominate, at least in the air, and hopefully the sea as well, the battle space, so that even if the landing on the island was difficult, yet the Japanese would not be able to get would not be able to resupply those forces by air or by sea, because the United States Navy and naval aviation was dominating the battle space even prior to the actual landing happening. And then finally, naval strategy. So it focuses on controlling sea lanes rather than ship to ship combat, right? So we see this in the South China Sea, for example, where mainland China has built these they're sort of man-made islands in an effort to encroach ever farther into the South China Sea and try and dominate that waterway as a prelude to potentially invading Taiwan or even the Philippines. And that's why U.S. naval ships, including the ship I was on when I deployed back in 2011, I believe was my deployment. We traversed the South China Sea because we consider it to be an international seaway or sea lane. Okay, and by periodically sailing through the South China Sea, we are signaling to China that we don't hold by the idea that this is kind of their exclusive territory, right? And that's a more efficient way of handling the situation. It's a choosing the battlefield strategy rather than having to fight ship to ship, because we let China, believe that in fact it's the South China Sea is its sole preserve. Okay, so those are the ways that we see from a military standpoint how choosing the battlefield fits into doctrine. So, so the idea is, don't fight the enemy where it's strongest or most prepared. Rather, look for ways by choosing the battlefield where we can meet weakness with strength. Okay, so that's the fundamental idea in this strategic concept of choosing the battlefield. All right, so let's translate this now into some business lessons. Okay, I've got 5 applications of this principle. So number 1, select a market you can shape, not just enter. Okay, so going back to the military for a moment, military leaders prefer terrain that can be controlled or influenced. Okay, so in business, before you select a market, define for yourself what is the category of product or service that I'm going to be providing, and how do I select the market that is most warm, most compatible, in which I should be competing. Okay, so I'll give you an example from my own business. I get probably 95% of my business from estate planning and probate and trust attorneys. Okay. Once in a while, I may get, a client from some other source, a real estate agent or someone involved in financial services or something for that. Okay. So I was offered an opportunity to work to do some marketing with somebody who's essentially a registered investment advisor, and he does seminars for potential investors. But here's the thing, that's not my market. My market is lawyers. So while it might be fun to get up in front of a bunch of people who have money to invest, okay, the chances that I'm going to get a client from them is very, very small. So I wouldn't be choosing the right battlefield to use that as a marketing strategy. Okay, I'm better off, maybe going to a bar association meeting for a section on estate planning and trust and probate administration. Okay, that's my battlefield, right? Because though that's where I can find clients. They're already clients of a lawyer, and if I can gain that lawyer's trust, so then when he needs someone to act as a independent trustee or administrate a probate, okay, so then he'll call me, right? So that's choosing the battlefield in the context of marketing a business. So what is the category? Who are your customers? Who are your sources of referrals if you're a professional like me, right? So while if I'm going to be trustee of a trust, my client is actually kind of the trust or the beneficiaries or the grantors of the trust, but trying to market to those people, I'd have to go through hundreds of them, if not thousands, to find one that might need, a trustee. Whereas lawyers are already doing that, right? They've already sifted through, so I can cut through all the noise and go directly to them. Okay, so that's one question. What can I define the category? Number 2, can I set pricing norms, right? So again, if I want to essentially, dominate a market, I need to know, where do I have the most pricing power? Okay. Again, to go directly to, trust grantors or trust beneficiaries and such. So they don't really have a sense of what professional pricing is a lot of times. And really, oftentimes what they're doing, they're just looking for the lowest price they can get. Well, I don't want to have to compete on price. Okay. So again, for me to go to lawyers, when my prices are cheaper than what lawyers charge, right? So by comparison, okay, my pricing strategy looks perfectly appropriate. And competitors of mine who do the same work I do, that is a competitor, right? It's redundant, but our fees are set because we're working at a certain level. We have a great deal of experience. We have a great deal of knowledge, and we are able to handle a level of complexity commensurate with with the fees that we charge. Okay, and so I don't want to be in a market where I have to compete on price, because what I found over the decades of my business career is there's always someone who's willing to charge a little bit less. Okay, and the one of the features of capitalism is, especially on the product side, is someone will continue to undercut on pricing until they get to the point where their profit is minimal. That's why for a lot of the items that we buy in a grocery store, although they're more expensive now than they were a few years ago, still the profit on any individual item is actually very small, oftentimes just a few pennies. Okay, and the food suppliers, the reason they make money is because they sell huge volumes. So I'm just going to pick a product. Hunt's canned tomatoes. Okay, do you ever have their fire roasted tomatoes? They're actually really good. Free plug for Hunt's, I guess. But anyway, that 15 and a half ounce can of tomatoes, I don't know, what do we pay these days, $1.19 or something like that? Maybe 3, 4, 5 cents of that is profit. Like, well, how can they make any money when they've got when they're making so little per can? Right, but when you think about it, they don't ship one can to a store. They don't even ship 10 cans to a store. They're probably shipping, who knows, 100, 200, 300 cans to each store. Right. And so the volume of goods that they sell make their business profitable, but the margins are very narrow. Okay. And because in a way, canned tomatoes are basically just a commodity, so they end up having to compete on price. That's why so many food suppliers try to develop an outstanding brand. That's why Hunt's wants to be Hunt's, because we know that brand. And for at least for people who grew up in my era, Hunt's was good. Store brand not as good. That was to put it at its simplest, right? So that's the idea of a brand, right? Is it has a cachet to it. It means higher quality. Now, whether that's true these days or not, because so many store brands are just white label brands that are being manufactured by Hunt's or by whoever is manufacturing for Hunt's. The food supply has gotten much more complicated over the last few decades, but nonetheless, the idea of a brand is to be able to then set pricing norms. Okay, otherwise we're not controlling the market, right? And so in business, that's what we want to look at. How can we set pricing norms? And then finally, can we set standards others must follow? Okay, so going back to my business, one of the things that I do that, as far as I can tell, no other professional fiduciary does, is I send out a weekly report on the status of all the matters that I'm handling. So a lawyer never has to reach out to me to find out what's going on. He knows every Thursday he's going to get an update. And if he has any questions, he can just, click reply to the email report and ask his questions. And so if his clients are on him about what's happening with this or what's happening with that, all he has to do is go back to the last email report that I sent and look it up and say, okay, here's what's going on. So it makes it super easy for him to keep track of what's happening on the administration side of a trust or probate matter. And so that really sets the standards. And I know from the attorneys that I've with whom I've spoken, that they view that as a big benefit, right? And that's one of the reasons why they choose to do business with me as opposed to one of my competitors. Now, maybe at some point, some of my competitors will clue in. Maybe they're watching the show and they're like, "Oh, this is what Kevin's doing. All right, we're going to do the same thing." Who knows? But and it's not the only way, of course, that I seek to establish the standards of the profession, but that is the idea. How can we set the standards, right? If we're selling fresh vegetables, right? Do they look the best? Do they taste the best, right? So you look at if you're familiar with cuties, right? The little tangerines, right? Cuties have sort of set the standards now for tangerines. So tangerines have to be easy to peel. They've got to be very sweet. They can't leave a lot of little threads on them, whatever. So that's why cuties has come to dominate the market for that particular food item. Okay, so entering a mature market with fixed rules. Okay, that's equivalent to attacking a fortified position, right? We're going to take on entrenched competitors. Okay, or are we going to look for a way to slip in behind them? Are we going to develop a new market where we can define the category, we can set the pricing, we can establish the standards? Okay, can we look? Cuties, I'm sorry, tangerines have been around for I don't know, at least since I was a kid, because my mother used to put them in my lunch when I was a little boy, right? Cuties came along and they, in essence, redefined the category, okay, and it allowed them to set pricing norms and establish standards. That's what they did. I mean, it was brilliant. Now you might say, well, in the end, it was just all marketing. Well, certainly marketing was a part of it. I mean, if you've ever driven through the Central Valley of California, you'll see the facilities where Cuties, does their distribution. But I think it's more than that. It was finding the right fruit to which this marketing strategy could be applied, right? So people have done it with tomatoes, like especially cherry tomatoes, but not as successfully. Chiquita bananas, that's kind of an early example. So, these marketing strategies have to be coupled with the correct products so you can define the category. Okay. So select markets you can shape, not just enter. That's number one. Number two, avoid head-on competition when asymmetry exists. Militaries avoid symmetric fights whenever they possibly can. Okay, so to go head to head with forces of a similar size and lethality as yours means that the deaths, the woundings are going to be higher. Okay, going up with an asymmetrical force where your forces dominate. Now I'm going to talk about that word dominate in just that concept of dominate in just a moment. But where your forces dominate are likely to reduce casualties, maybe even on both sides. So it's not like you're necessarily going to take your dominant forces and go and wipe out the enemy. What you're looking to do is convince the enemy that they're so dominated that they refuse to fight, okay, or they stop fighting, right? Now, when I say dominate, that doesn't necessarily mean having the most number of soldiers or the most number of ships. What it means is creating a sense that victory for the enemy cannot be attained on anything like acceptable terms. And so, in essence, surrender or just withdrawing from the battlefield is the better option. Okay, so that's what I mean about dominate. It's not necessarily, well, I've got a force of, I've got a 10,000 man division and I'm fighting, 1,000 gorillas. That wouldn't necessarily be a case of domination, because the fighting is if the fighting is asymmetrical, which it would be in that case. So to be able to concentrate the 10,000 men of that division in a way that convinces the 1,000 guerrillas to give up could well nigh be impossible. That's the experience in Afghanistan, for example, right? And so when we think about avoiding head-on competition, okay, and creating or finding an asymmetrical situation, okay, in on the business side. So we don't want to challenge incumbents on their core strengths. Okay, so let's go back to Coca-Cola. Okay, to challenge Coca-Cola to a cola war, probably going to lose. Okay, probably going to lose. Now, where might Coca-Cola be vulnerable? Well, it could be vulnerable on a cola drink that's perceived to be healthy, because nobody looks at a Coca-Cola and goes, oh, this is really good for my health, right? So there are opportunities to fight asymmetrical battles with, products, right? So maybe there's an opportunity to take on Coca-Cola with taste, or with attractiveness of packaging. Okay, although the Coca-Cola bottle is pretty iconic, right? But the idea is, don't attack them at their core strength. Look for a way to shave off part of their market. Okay, so this is what's happened over the last couple of decades with the healthier food trends. And it's why a lot of foods that were very dominant in various categories have lost a great deal of market share. Let's take breakfast cereal. Breakfast cereal was when I was a child and a teenager, was a healthy breakfast. In fact, even into my young and sort of mid adulthood, like, breakfast cereal was what you ate for breakfast. Right now, not so much. People are they're looking for, in some cases, healthier breakfast options, and so they don't eat cereal nearly as much, and that's why you saw Kellogg's spin off their cereal making division, and different things like that. So um, more recently, the idea of protein for breakfast has become much more popular. I think that's in part because with the various weight loss drugs, people who are taking them are told to focus on protein consumption, and cereals, for the most part, are not particularly high in protein, whereas meat, eggs, these are protein-rich foods, and so they have replaced cereal as a breakfast mainstay, right? So for companies that want to get in, another category that's become a breakfast food is yogurt. Look at the expansion of choices in yogurt. There's Greek yogurt, there's Icelandic yogurt, like all these different, sort of regional brands. But then there's goat's milk yogurt, there's cow's milk yogurt, there's the French yogurt that's almost like custard. There's the goat yogurt that I get from Trader Joe's that's very soft and light and easy to digest, right? So these products, rather than going, after the dominant makers, they've tried to peel off just parts of the market, and that's a way of gaining success while avoiding head-on competition. Okay, so look for an opportunity where maybe speed of delivery of the product, or the design of the product, or distribution of the product, or trust matter more than scale. Now, some of these won't necessarily apply to your business. So while I think trust applies to pretty much everything, whether it's a product or a service, distribution is maybe more of a product focused aspect, although I know for my business, the ability to do Zoom meetings and that kind of thing allows me to distribute my services more efficiently and more effectively, right? And so, it is something that I think about sometimes. Okay. So, especially for those of us who are in small businesses, right? Asymmetric competition, it really favors the smaller, more adaptive business. Okay. And that's how we can compete with larger companies that have more bureaucracy, take more time to make decisions, take more time to execute those decisions once they're made, right? And for larger companies, how can you make yourself more nimble so that you can take advantage of these kind of asymmetric opportunities and potentially beat out your smaller competitors? Okay. So if your only advantage is trying harder, right, then you've chosen the wrong battlefield. So I think it was either Avis or Hertz back in I think it was 70s. Their marketing slogan was "We try harder," right? And essentially, they were conceding that there wasn't any real difference between Hearst car rental and Avis car rental. It's just, I think it was Hertz. We try harder, right? We're really in there plugging for you, right? You know, I don't think that's an effective strategy. It's certainly not a choosing the battlefield strategy. Okay, number 3, use exits and withdrawals as strategic tools. Okay, so from a military standpoint, not every battle needs to be fought to its bitter end. So, sometimes forces will engage in a battle and pretty quickly it becomes obvious, oop, nope, we're not going to win this one. Or winning this one is going to be too costly in terms of lives, in terms of materiel, etc. So a strategic withdrawal may be the better option, right? Save your forces to fight another day. So in business as well, this is also part of choosing your battlefield. So sometimes exiting a market can strengthen the core. Okay. So some businesses, they'll, especially large companies where they're growing by acquiring other businesses, they acquire products and they hang on to them for a while in order, because they have them, it's almost inertial in that sense, right? But periodically, some companies do. If they don't, they should review their product lineup and say, wait a minute, which of these are really strengthen our core business, and which of them aren't really part of our core business, and then exit those markets or sell off those products that don't really strengthen the core. Okay. And in that way, they can focus better on their strengths and not be distracted. Okay. So it not only means, not wasting resources for marketing, etc., on a suboptimal product, but it also gives leadership the headspace to be able to focus better on what needs to be done to really drive improvements in the core offerings. Okay, so being able to say no is often the highest form of discipline. Okay, so I know for going back to my business now for a moment. So when I first got started, look, I would pretty much take any assignment, any probate administration that was offered to me. Okay, I have come to regret that decision, frankly. But nowadays, it's very difficult for me to justify taking smaller cases for a number of reasons. One is a probate takes a certain amount of work, no matter what the size. However, the fees for them are based on the assets under administration. And so if it takes, let's say, 100 hours to administrate a probate over a 12 to 18 month period, um, that 100 hours isn't much different for an estate valued at $1 million versus one valued at $2 to $3 million. Okay, but the fee for the $2 million estate, it's not double that for a $1 million estate, but it's probably like 1.75 times. And the fee for a $3 million estate is probably, 2 times the fee of a $1 million estate, but it's the same amount of work. Right. And so you'll find in people in my business, professional trustees who do this kind of administration, we pretty quickly leave behind administrating smaller estates because it's not the right market. We may start there, but we exit that part of the business, pretty much as soon as we can, because it doesn't make sense to continue there. Now, I do have a friend who that is his core business. $5 million and below is what he does. He has a very efficient, highly regimented process. And so, because of because he does such a huge volume, so he can cut in half the time it takes to administrate a small estate versus what it would take me. Okay, so it makes much more sense for me to refer a small estate to my friend Josh, who's I think he's got an episode coming up on Trust and Estates Weekly. Let him do it. Okay. And I'll focus on where I can add value, which is in estates $5 million and up. Okay. So saying no is important. Just because a piece of business is, wagged in front of us doesn't mean we have to take it. Okay. So staying in a losing market, it's not persistence, it's erosion, and it's eroding our overall businesses. Okay. Number 4. Force competitors to respond on your terms, on our terms, right? So through feints, through positioning, through tempo, right? Military leaders, commanders try to force the enemy to behave the way they want their enemy to behave, okay? As opposed to letting the enemy respond the way the enemy thinks is best. So we need to do that in business as well. We need to change the basis of competition, right? So that's going back to the example that I gave a few minutes ago about sending out weekly reports. I'm changing the way that people have to compete, okay, by providing this service that is of value, okay, and avoids misunderstandings. It avoids sometimes conflict, right? I'm changing the basis of competition. I'm in essence forcing my competitors to compete on my terms, not their own. Okay, so the idea is to shift from price to experience, to trust, to being part of an ecosystem. So this is somewhat related to when we talked about do you control the category, do you control the pricing, etc., right? So if we can shift kind of the rules of the game and force our competitors to respond to what we're doing rather than our having to respond to what they're doing, we are choosing the battlefield. In this case, we're creating the battlefield. So whether it's the quality of our product, whether it's the amount of trust that a customer or client has in our product, whether it's here's a great example, right? Apple computers. Apple computers are part of a larger ecosystem that includes, right? It includes iPhones, and it includes iPads, it includes Apple Watch, right? I'm in the ecosystem, right? Apple has captured me as a customer and I've bought into its ecosystem. I don't have any non-Apple devices in my house. Okay, at least where Apple has a device, I guess is the best way to put it. Like, this is not an Apple printer, but Apple doesn't make printers, right? So Apple is forcing competitors, in essence, to respond on their terms. Okay, and finally, understand terrain beyond the market. Okay, so military terrain is not just the battlefield is not just those items that I talked about at the beginning of the show: terrain, timing, force disposition, operational reach, and enemy constraints. Those are part of the battlefield, but there are other dimensions, if you will, to the battlefield. There are political dimensions, there are social dimensions. Okay. All of these have an impact on choosing the battlefield. This is why, or at least one of the reasons why war is such a complex endeavor, because it isn't happening just in the battlefield. Even if we're talking about the battlefield, writ large, where we're talking about the entire, battle space, still there are the political and social dimensions of fighting. Okay. And those are almost always beyond the battlefield. Okay. So the same thing is true in the business world, right? So we have regulations, could be local, state, federal, even international, right? We have culture, we have availability of people, we have distribution channels. Those are all part of the larger concept of choosing the battlefield, right? So if you're thinking about expanding overseas, it is now a favorable time to consider expanding into mainland China. Maybe not. The United States and China are, pretty, not pretty. They're fierce competitors. There's not a whole lot of love lost between them, I think. And this may not be the best time for Americans to be trying to enter the Chinese market. Okay. On the other hand, there may be markets that are very favorable to the United States. Israel, very favorable to the United States right now. Okay. Some of the Arab countries, as much as we hear about this and that in the news, Bahrain, the UAE, even Saudi Arabia, looking pretty favorably on the United States these days. Okay. So that's, as we choose the battlefield, in this case on an international basis, where does it look best? And not just in the here and now, but long term, where is the battlefield that over the long term, where is the market over the long term that looks best for us? Okay, so battlefields are multi-dimensional spaces. Markets are multi-dimensional spaces. They're not, spreadsheets where we can, easily sort of plug in this and that, and okay, this looks great, off we go. They're chaotic. Battlefields are chaotic. Markets are chaotic. They can change rapidly. Both can change rapidly, right? That's why the idea of choosing your battlefield, choosing your market, okay, again, market writ large, is such an important concept as we look to guide our businesses through the 21st century. So, smart leaders, they win before the first fight, really. They don't outfight their competitors, they outposition them. Okay. And choosing the battlefield is as much about restraint, patience, and clarity as it is about actually fighting, because the easiest way to lose is to charge forward somewhat blindly without considering whether the ground on which the battle is going to be fought is more hostile than another alternative. Okay, so that's my thoughts on choosing the battlefield. I thank you for joining me. Got some live viewers here today. That's always great. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. is my show, People Making Money. And every other Thursday, please join me at Jiggers' Place at 5 p.m. Pacific time for a cocktail and a schmooze. Talk about things unrelated to our financial lives. So once again, thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate your viewership. If you have questions, comments, criticisms, links to the social media will be available when this episode posts on YouTube. And if you're watching it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please, if you like the show, please post a favorable comment. I'd really appreciate the opportunity to gain some additional viewers and help out more people. So I wish you a wonderful rest of the day, and signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are my belle. Courage at all